They called him the last Roman, a man born from nothing, who rebuilt an empire that had long since fallen to dust. A general who fought not for riches or glory, but for Rome itself, an idea older than any king or emperor. His name was Flavius Belisarius, the greatest commander of the Byzantine Empire, and one of the most tragic figures in history. For nearly 40 years, he won wars that should have been impossible, only to die under suspicion. Abandoned by the emperor he had served with absolute loyalty. His story is not just about conquest, it's about power, trust, and the loneliness of greatness. Belisarius was born around the year 500 inches, a world standing at the edge of darkness. The old Roman Empire was gone. The West had fallen to barbarian kings. And what remained in the East, the Byzantine world, was a fragile echo of past glory. Somewhere in the borderlands of Thrace or Illyria, in what is now Bulgaria, a child was born into poverty. His village lay between mountains and marshes, where Roman law met barbarian freedom, and neither ruled completely. His father was no senator, no patrician, just another soldier farmer surviving on the empire's forgotten frontier. But even in that wilderness, the legends of Rome still lingered. Stories of Caesar, of legions, of the eagles that once marched unchallenged across the world. To the boy who would become Belisarius, these weren't just tales. They were promises that courage could rise from anywhere. He was tall for his age, quiet and observant, the kind of boy who listened more than he spoke. Those who knew him said he had the patience of a hunter and the eyes of one too. As a teenager, he enlisted in the Imperial Guard, a long shot for someone of his background. The guards were men of discipline and pedigree, stationed in Constantinople, the dazzling capital of the Byzantine world. Imagine what that city must have looked like to a young soldier from the frontier. Vast domes glinting under the sun, streets filled with scholars, traders, priests, and thieves, all living in the shadow of the great palace. The empire still called itself Roman, but its heart had changed. Greek was the language of learning, Christianity its soul, bureaucracy its bloodstream. And yet, for all its splendor, Constantinople trembled with fear of its enemies, of rebellion, and of its own fading memory of greatness. Serving in the Guard, Belisarius learned more than the art of war. He learned silence, discipline, and how to read the ambitions of men. Among those ambitions was a rising star, Justinian, the brilliant and relentless nephew of Emperor Justin I. Justinian noticed the young soldier's calm precision. While others boasted of lineage or skill, Belisarius simply listened. He drilled his men tirelessly, treated his comrades with fairness, and never sought glory for himself. It was said that Justinian once remarked, "If Rome had 1,000 men like him, it would never have fallen." When Emperor Justin died in 527, Justinian ascended the throne, and he remembered the tall, silent guardsman from the frontier. He summoned Belisarius, not as a bodyguard, but as a commander. Belisarius's first true test came far from Constantinople on the eastern frontier, where empires had been bleeding each other for centuries. Across the border stood the Sassanid Empire, rich, ancient, and proud. Its cavalry were the finest in the East, its generals veterans of 100 campaigns. To face them was to face history itself. It was 530 AD. The sun blazed down on the plains near Dara, a fortress on the edge of Mesopotamia. Belisarius was barely in his 30s, commanding an army half the size of his opponents. To most, the battle looked hopeless. But Belisarius was not like other commanders. He studied war as if it were mathematics, a problem to be solved, not an act of rage. He built trenches disguised beneath sand, shaped the terrain to funnel enemy charges, and placed his cavalry where the Persians would least expect.
The finest in the east.
At dawn, the Sassanids advanced armored cataphracts shimmering like a river of steel. Their drums thundered, their banners cut the sky. Belisarius waited. Then the signal. From behind dunes, Byzantine cavalry burst forth, smashing into the Persian flanks. Hidden trenches tore through their formation. The desert became chaos, dust, screams, sunlight flashing on broken armor. By nightfall, the Sassanid host was shattered. Dara became more than a victory, it was a revelation. A new kind of Roman general had emerged, one who fought not with numbers, but with intellect. In Constantinople, the news was greeted like a miracle. Justinian had found his sword, and it had a mind of its own. But war has a way of humbling even its brightest stars. A year later, Belisarius faced the Persians again, this time at Callinicum, on the banks of the Euphrates. The fight was fierce, brutal, fought beneath a burning desert sky.
All back!
This
Hold the
time,
line!
fortune turned. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, his army began to crumble. Belisarius ordered a fighting retreat, holding the line long enough to save what remained of his forces. It was a defeat, yes, but it was a disciplined defeat, one that preserved the army, and with it, the empire's honor. When he returned to Constantinople, whispers of failure spread. Court rivals urged Justinian to strip him of command. But the emperor saw something different. A man who would accept blame without excuse, who valued survival over pride. In Justinian's mind, that humility was rarer and more valuable than any victory. 2 years later, in 532 AD, Belisarius's courage would be tested not on foreign soil, but at home. Constantinople, the shining capital of the Byzantine world, erupted in fury. The Nika revolt began as a riot at the Hippodrome, a clash between rival chariot racing factions, the Blues and the Greens. But the anger ran deeper than sport. Taxes, corruption, religious disputes, all the frustrations of the empire boiled over. Crowds filled the streets, chanting one word: Nika, conquer! Soon, the mob turned on Justinian himself. Palaces burned, churches fell. For 5 days, the city became a war zone. The emperor, terrified, considered fleeing. The throne and the empire hung by a thread. But two people stood firm. Empress Theodora, whose words cut through the panic, "A throne is a fine burial shroud," and Belisarius, who waited calmly for orders. Justinian turned to the only man he could trust. Belisarius took command of a few thousand loyal soldiers, veterans of Dara, men who had faced Persian cataphracts and lived. But this was different. This time, their enemy was their own people. At dawn, they marched toward the Hippodrome, where tens of thousands had gathered, shouting for Justinian's head and proclaiming a new emperor. Belisarius gave a single, chilling command: seal the exits. The gates slammed shut. The crowd realized too late. There was no escape. Belisarius's troops advanced, shields locked, swords drawn, arrows rained from the galleries. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. By nightfall, the Hippodrome floor was red with blood. 30,000 lay dead. It was horrific, but it saved the empire. When the smoke cleared, Constantinople still stood. Justinian's crown remained on his head, and Belisarius, though stained by what he'd done, had proven the unthinkable, that he could do whatever was necessary to preserve Rome's last breath of power. After the revolt, Justinian looked at his general with new eyes. This man, born of peasants, had crushed Persia's pride and saved an emperor's throne. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a weapon forged in loyalty, tempered by restraint, and utterly essential to Justinian's dream, the restoration of Rome. A few years later, Justinian unveiled his dream to reclaim the lost provinces of the Western Roman Empire. His first target, North Africa. For a century, the Vandal kingdom had ruled from Carthage, rich and defiant. Few believed the Byzantines could reach them across the Mediterranean. But in 533, Belisarius led an expedition of just 15,000 men, a fraction of what his enemies commanded. He sailed quietly along the African coast, keeping his fleet within sight of land and innovation at the time. He landed near modern-day Tunisia and advanced on Carthage. At Ad Decimum, his vanguard collided with the Vandals. The battle hung by a thread. Belisarius's discipline, his ability to coordinate troops in chaos, turned the tide. 3 days later, at Tricamarum, the Vandal king Gelimer was defeated. The war had lasted barely 3 months. For the first time since the fall of Rome, the imperial banners flew again over Africa. Belisarius returned to Constantinople in triumph, the last man in history to be granted a Roman triumph, a parade once reserved for Caesars. He was made consul of the Roman Republic, the final holder of that ancient title. But Justinian was not done. The emperor now turned his gaze to Italy, to the land that had once been Rome itself, now ruled by the Ostrogoths. In 535, Belisarius set sail once more. He captured Sicily in a single campaign. Then, crossing to the mainland, he took Naples after a brutal siege, tunneling through an ancient aqueduct to surprise the defenders. By December 536, Rome was his. For a moment, history seemed to turn backward, as if the old Roman Empire had been reborn. But the war was far from over. The Goths regrouped under King Witiges and besieged the Eternal City. Belisarius held out for months. With dwindling supplies, he ordered citizens to melt statues for metal, forged weapons from church bells, and rationed food to the last crumb. When reinforcements finally arrived, the Goths withdrew exhausted, humiliated. In 540, Belisarius struck back. He marched north and laid siege to Ravenna, the Gothic capital.
Close the circle!
Inside the city, famine and despair grew. The Goths, desperate for peace, offered Belisarius the Western crown to become Emperor of the West. It was treason, but Belisarius played along. He accepted the offer only to march his army through Ravenna's gates, seize the city, and declare it for Justinian. No bloodshed, no betrayal, just a victory of intellect and restraint. Yet that very act, that mixture of genius and independence, planted seeds of suspicion in the emperor's mind. When Belisarius returned to Constantinople, he was met with parades, songs, and garlands of laurel. The people cheered the hero who had reclaimed Africa, Italy, and the glory of Rome itself. But inside the palace, amid the gold and marble, the air was colder. Justinian, the emperor who had once trusted Belisarius above all men, now watched him with suspicion. He had restored Italy, humbled Persia, and doubled the empire's size, achievements that would have made any emperor immortal. And yet, in Belisarius, Justinian no longer saw a servant. He saw a shadow, tall, silent, admired by the people. A shadow that fell across his own throne. At court, whispers spread like poison. He's too popular. And on. He commands the army's loyalty. He dreams of being emperor himself. Belisarius heard the rumors. He could have rebelled, many urged him to. The Goths had once offered him a crown, but he refused, every time. His loyalty was absolute, his pride buried beneath discipline. Still, in the glittering corridors of Constantinople, loyalty was not a shield, it was a target. The years dragged on. Justinian began to sideline his general, sending him to distant borders, commanding smaller, meaningless campaigns. Each time, Belisarius obeyed. Each time, he returned victorious. And each time, his rewards grew smaller. In 542, the plague came. It struck Constantinople like divine wrath. Half the city died, peasants, soldiers, nobles. Even Justinian himself nearly succumbed. When the emperor recovered, he was not the same. He had become paranoid, withdrawn, a man haunted by death and obsessed with control. The empire, too, faltered. In Italy, rebellion flared once again. The Gothic War, thought long over, was reigniting. And so Justinian called for Belisarius once more, but this time he sent him without funds, without reinforcements, without trust. It was a cruel test, a mission designed to fail. Yet Belisarius fought on. With dwindling supplies and unpaid men, he marched back into Italy, reclaiming Rome for a second time in 547. The campaign was brutal. The people who had once hailed him as liberator now watched in silence, exhausted by war. There was no triumphal entry, no parade, only the sound of wind in ruined streets and the tolling of empty churches. By 549, Justinian replaced him with Narses, a eunuch courtier whose obedience was guaranteed and whose victories would never threaten the emperor's pride. Belisarius returned to Constantinople once again, this time not as a hero, but as a relic. He built churches and monasteries, funded from what little wealth he had left. Perhaps he hoped to wash the blood from his hands, or perhaps he simply wanted peace. But peace, in the empire he had bled for, was never granted. He had restored the empire's borders only to see its heart decay from within. Corruption spread where courage once stood. And the man who had been Rome's last sword was now its silence. In 559, Belisarius was 60 years old. His hair had turned white, his once steady hands trembled, but his mind remained sharp, his instincts intact. That year, the Bulgars crossed the Danube. The capital panicked. The empire's armies were scattered, its generals inexperienced. And so, once again, they turned to the old soldier. Belisarius gathered what men he could, a pitiful force of veterans, servants, even stable boys. The same city that once celebrated him now offered little more than silence. Yet when the enemy approached Constantinople, it was Belisarius who rode out to meet them. Through cunning positioning, ambushes, and sheer mastery of terrain, he shattered the Bulgar advance and drove them back across the river. The empire was saved again. When news reached Justinian, he offered no parade, no reward, only a brief acknowledgement, a few words, cold and ceremonial. The message was clear. The emperor's throne was secure, and his old general's usefulness was over. 3 years later, the unthinkable happened. Belisarius was accused of corruption, of taking bribes, embezzling funds, and stealing from the empire he had spent a lifetime defending. The charges were absurd, but politically convenient. Jealous courtiers, bureaucrats, and generals, men who had never seen battle, seized the chance to destroy a legend. He was arrested, stripped of honors, and thrown into prison. And, in a cruel twist of fate, his own former secretary Procopius, the historian who had once chronicled his victories, may have overseen the trial. In the darkness of his cell, Belisarius had time to think. He had killed thousands for his emperor, saved millions more, and now sat chained like a criminal. Perhaps he wondered if loyalty itself had been his greatest mistake. For months, He waited for execution that never came. Then, perhaps fearing the backlash of killing Rome's last hero, Justinian relented. Belisarius was pardoned, stripped of command but allowed to live out his days in quiet obscurity. He retired to a small estate on the Asian side of Constantinople, tending gardens where once he had commanded empires. Centuries later, Europe would remember him not as a general, but as a beggar. A tale spread across monasteries and courts that Justinian, consumed by paranoia, had blinded Belisarius, forcing him to wander the streets of the capital, a cloak over his ruined eyes, a bowl in his hand. "Give a coin," he was said to whisper, "to Belisarius, whom virtue has impoverished." There is no evidence this ever happened, but the legend endured because it felt true. It captured something deeper than fact, the injustice of genius, the loneliness of loyalty. A man who gave everything to his emperor and received nothing in return. A soldier who rebuilt an empire only to die forgotten. In reality, Belisarius died peacefully in 565 AD, the same year as Justinian. The emperor and his general, bound together in both glory and suspicion, vanished from history almost hand in hand. Together, they had expanded the Byzantine Empire by nearly half more territory than it would ever again control. And yet, when Belisarius was buried, there was no monument, no triumph, no parade. Only a modest tomb and a name whispered through generations. The last great Roman. Empires remember their rulers. But civilizations endure because of men like Belisarius, those who fight, not for crowns, but for duty. Today, his name stands as both a triumph and a warning, a reminder that even the mightiest soldier can be undone, not by his enemies, but by the hands he served. History remembers empires, but we remember the people who built them. If you want to keep discovering the untold lives of extraordinary men and women, heroes, traitors, and forgotten geniuses, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and ring the bell, because every week we bring another legend back to life.